Okay, namaste. My name is Dr. Poonam Sharma and I belong to the Virat Hindustan Sangam, VHS family in Australia. Before we start this talk, I want to pay our respects to the elders in Australia. In the spirit of reconciliation, VHS acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. Right, so this talk is for VHS. VHS was founded by Dr. Subramanian Swamy to educate the educated youngsters of India on the heritage and the culture of their sacred indigenous land, that is Bharat, and to pave for a Hindu renaissance based on the concepts of Sanatana Dharma. Viewers, do please visit our website, vhsindia.org, for more details. Welcome to our Jarcha with Malini on one of the most important topics that we think every Hindu needs to be aware of, and that is Hinduphobia. Malini is an Australian Dharmic cultural studies scholar at Edith Cowan University and is an adherent of the Kashmir Shaivite tradition. You'll be surprised to know that it was her study that contributed to the first ever entry of the word Hinduphobia in an online dictionary powered by Oxford. She has also published several articles on Hinduphobia, and her work employs a decolonized epistemology learned within a Gurukul system over the last 28 years and fine-tuned within her ongoing PhD on yogic ecology. Welcome, Malinji. Welcome to our program. Firstly, let me congratulate you on the first ever entry in an online Oxford dictionary called Lexico. I'd like to read out the definition in Lexico for our viewers. It is as follows. So Hinduphobia is described as dislike of or prejudice against Hinduism or Hindus, and the origin is mid-19th century from Hindu plus phobia. So Malini, could you tell our viewers more about how this term started in the 1800s and what it implies? And why did you think it was important to add this word to a dictionary? And what challenges did you face on the way, if any? So there's a lot of questions there.
It's 3 in 1. I'll take them in chronological order, and I just want to make a little tweak to the intro. I've been unenrolled from Edith Cowan for a little while because I needed to take a bit of a pause and realign myself, and I'll be going back there shortly. I have another 2 years to finish my PhD. They've let me do it at a part-time loading, which is wonderful because that gives me time to do all of the other things, because I had so many questions to answer. I couldn't just study interconnectedness and how all beings are one and, you know, what this means for the future of humanity without understanding what the barriers to that knowledge really were. And Hinduphobia is one of the reasons why I had to take a bit of a hiatus, I guess, in between, because it's such a complex topic, and we didn't know that it went back to 1866.
Very surprising, yeah.
Yeah. So it sort of came out in a book by Sir Edward Sullivan, and there's 3 Sir Edward Sullivans. So this one's from England, and it's in a book about Islamic invasion of India, and it sets out, you know, within the first 3 chapters, I guess the issue of going to India, not just to convert the heathens, for example, or the non-believers, not as an assimilation of religious conquest, but as an assimilation of economic conquest. The argument that Sir Edward Sullivan makes when he refers to Hinduphobia is that they didn't come there just, the British didn't come to India just to civilize them. They came to India because India was wealthy, and they weren't wealthy just because Muslims had built up that economic wealth, because the Muslims had already come to India, and they had, in a similar way, administratively colonised India rather than this settler colonisation that happened here in Australia. It's a different colonisation pattern, but a few were able to grab hold of the administration. They were able to grab hold of economics. And Sir Edward Sullivan tells a story about Somanath, where they cut the nose of the god and they took out all of the riches from inside it. And they did that specifically because they wanted to target a god which was revered by everyone from India, and to demoralize the community, because on one hand they wanted wealth and riches and power, and on the other hand they needed to subjugate in order to maintain that power. So it's not a simple one-to-one relation between we're coming here to civilize you. And I think we see the same pattern, which is it's drawn out from that first use of Hinduphobia, that the British came for a similar reason. They didn't just come because they were uplifting. It wasn't a benevolent colonialism as we've been taught. And the same goes with other British colonialism. So there's a lot of parallels between the experience of British colonialism in different countries. And there's also differences because it was administrative colonialism. And to do that, they had to subjugate, they had to demoralize, they had to infiltrate the psychology of the people to have them come along. So it's a very different equation. And the roots of that rely upon that superior-inferior relationship that people need to build with their subjugated masses. So there was a superiority complex that came in, a supremacism from both sides that said that our way is the one way, our way is the superior way, your way is the inferior way. And so this supremacy creates this dislike. It's kind of like a deeply psychologically embedded sense of superiority that it's internalized, and then that's it has to be maintained over time. So Hinduphobia is complex. It's not the mirror image of other types of phobias, because every different type of oppression has different historic circumstances. It's not necessarily that they were hated. It's that they needed to be subjugated. So I think it's important to remember that Hinduphobia is a historic concept that has been built up over time, and it does refer to colonisation and the relation that the colonisers had with their subjugated masses. So this needs to be continually remembered. They don't need to hate you. They don't need to even really dislike you. They just need to have a prejudice or a bias that could be self-serving. It could be just to serve their own interests. So I think prejudice works well, but I think dislike and hatred and fear are beside the point, because you can't stop someone from disliking something. If I don't like something, I can't be made accountable for disliking, for example, a book or an opinion. It runs deeper than that. It's a sense of supremacy.
So some people seem to think that today, Hinduphobia means a fear of Hindus. But this original definition, a dislike or a prejudice against Hindus and Hinduism, is quite different, isn't it? It really does, it really does point to what we see today in academia.
So phobia, as the sense of irrational fear that was popularised by Freud, came later. The word Hinduphobia came before Freud, and the roots of phobia, is phobos in Greek, is terror, and it comes in a cognate of, it's a compound noun, and those compound nouns have been used for millennia. So we had hydrophobia, and that was the word for rabies. And in Sanskrit, the word for rabies is rabasa. And there's a lot of themes and tropes that come with that in terms of xenophobia, insider, outsider, pure and polluted, rabies, dogs, and, the marginalised, the dehumanised, the supernatural, the possessed, the person who is frothing at the mouth, whose uncontrolled ambivalent emotions take a hold of them, and they can't be trusted, these people, because they don't have a grip on their own behaviours. So, you know, this demonisation comes in, but also that ambivalent relationship in hydrophobia is that they want water, but they can't drink it. And it's a similar way with India. We want to have the culture on our own terms, but we can't drink from the actual culture itself.
So like yoga and, you know, a lot of other things that have been appropriate by the West, there's a want, you know, but they don't want to acknowledge.
They won't give you credit because they want to strip out that cultural capital to benefit themselves. It's that similar type of extension of colonial relationship where we want you, but on our own terms, and otherwise we're disgusted by you.
Yeah.
And this definition of lexico talks about fear of Hinduism and Hindus, which is slightly inaccurate. And I do want to talk a little bit about that.
If you can tell us a bit more about that.
Well, if you look at the usage, they've been a bit slack, to be honest. And I thank Oxford English Dictionary, Michael Prophet, for his wonderful openness to discuss this. And he sent me an email and he said that he was you know, going to look into, the lexicographers would look into the word usage to come up with a definition. But I was expecting they would come up with a bespoke definition for the use of the word. When you look at Hinduphobia used by Sadindra Bose in America, he was talking about Hindustanis. And when you look at the Mahabharata and you understand who is a Bharatvashi, we're not talking about a distinction of sect. And in Sanatana Dharma, there are so many sects that occupy sometimes contradictory spaces. They occupy, you know, they're able to coexist because we enable complex contradictory thought. And we don't have that in dualistic traditions, Western traditions. There's good and evil, and never the twain shall they meet. Whereas in our system, there's complexity at every single level, and it's very much in line with systems theory and complexity theory and chaos theory and all these wonderful scientific models. They're outside that dualistic box. So when we talk about Hindus, Hindustan, who is a Hindustani? We're not talking about even a specific ethnicity. We're talking about a people and the ways in which they define themselves in terms of Sanatana Dharma. Is that they're a cultural ethos that is pluralistic, and it can be inclusive of people who weren't from that country. For example, in the Mahabharata, it talks about who is one of their people, and it includes people who are not born in India. So who is a Hindustani? What is Hinduphobia? And is it in relation to a people and a cultural civilizational ethos rather than Hinduism, you know?
Okay.
Can you see the difference?
Yes,
when they say prejudice against Hinduism, they're saying it's a prejudice against something which was defined by academics, Western academics and Indologists. And the ways in which they define Hinduism don't actually match with the indigenous self-identity. So it's flawed at the root, and it actually narrows things. And then they've removed this as a political force, which they've given to Islam, because Islam is openly a political force. But as we see through the history of Hindustan, Hindus were constantly engaged in political activity. It's all through the scriptures. I mean, the whole order of the fabric of society is political. So to deny that into making it Hinduism, which is supposed to be a very, you know, I guess it's effeminized. People have effeminized Hinduism to make it fit into these little boxes, and it's not allowed to be political. And they criticize and they scrutinize those elements of what they call power all the time within the academic discourse. It's all about power and how the different sects were supported by the powers that be, and they were having rivalry with other peoples. I mean, even in itself, that is political. So why are we able to extract that out and say, oh, you know, it doesn't include Hindus as a political force, when we see so far that this whole negation of politicism is behind the distinction between what they call real Hindus and Hinduphobia. And they say real Hindus are not Hinduphobia because Hindu politics is made up and it doesn't extend from Hinduism. It's something separate. But as you read, even in the early work of Sarvaka, he's quoting from the Vedas. So how do you separate them? It's impossible. And just to make a claim that Hindus aren't political, the very reason why people are expressing themselves in this way on social media, in the media, in academia, is a fear of the politics, the economic rise of Bharat.
Yeah, the social media has allowed a lot of self-expression for Hindus, which is very good to see.
Yeah, so it's about Bharatvasis, it's about Hindustanis. It's not about a specific little ideology called Hinduism.
So I just wanted Mali to go on to the next point. As Hindus, we lack institutions, both in India and abroad, that are researching Hinduphobia and the impacts that it has on Hindus in Bharat and in the diaspora. What do you think Hindus should be doing about this? Because we lack institutions. Institutions that are studying, what Hinduphobia is and how it's impacting Hindus both in India and abroad.
Well, I think we lack, reliable data. I think that people are reluctant to cooperate when it comes to doing surveys because they have fixed misconceptions. And that's based on this void of understanding the etymology and the history of the word use. And that's reinforced to some extent by the lack of a definition in a dictionary. How is anybody supposed to understand it if they deny that the word is even a legitimate term? So what do we need to do about it is, I don't think it's wise to go off ad hoc. I think those scholars who are working on Hinduphobia need to cooperate with one another, need to read and evaluate one another's research, and then to build on that research over time and to quantify and to intersect that knowledge of what we know about the term and its usage with what we know about how Hinduphobia is experienced on the ground in Australia, in America, in Fiji, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Indonesia, in each of these different locations, because, in Bangladesh and Pakistan and India, in Afghanistan, in UK, all of these conditions are entirely radically different. So you can't make a blanket, yes, it exists, no, it doesn't exist, because they say that, it doesn't happen in America, but even the FBI says that there are, a very small number of cases of Hindu hate crime, which is the very, very extreme end of Hinduphobia. So you can't deny it. It's there.
It would make a fascinating study to see how different groups of Indians, both in India, overseas, in the diaspora, it'd be a fascinating study to see how that Hinduphobia, varies. But another thing I wanted to ask you, Mani, was how can Hindus around the world and from our audience help you in furthering your research into Hinduphobia? I know that you were involved in a Hinduphobia survey recently. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
So I conducted just a very basic survey. I have a subscription to SurveyMonkey, and I would love to be asking people for volumes and volumes, because I have so many questions. I just really want to know, how is Hinduphobia experienced? But if people don't understand to begin with what it actually signifies and how to apply it to their own experience, because even people like me who are from the privileged group or the dominant group in society, and the same goes in India. I mean, the dominant group, the majority are Hindu. I'm from a majority class in this country, and the difference of opinions between the members of that majority class on what Hindu culture is, and especially as a yoga teacher, have impacted on my experience, my ability to express myself. I've lost a job in a recreation centre because I refused to water my teachings down to suit a Pilates type of teaching. I mean, they came in and they looked at what I was doing and they said, we don't think they're going to understand this. But I was teaching Mula Bandha to women most of whom had had children. I was explaining to them that if you do Mula Bandha, it's just like doing other types of pelvic floor exercise. Like using the word Mula Bandha, teaching pelvic floor exercises is considered to be good and bad.
They want you to strip the Hinduism from it to make it more acceptable for a Western practitioner, I guess, which is a shame because they lose so much.
Well, they lose the whole concept of the root binding, the root binding. I mean, there's so much power in that, bringing your power up. It empowers women because no longer is all your Shakti, all your prana flowing downward and out like we have each cycle of the month. And in our energy, we're constantly giving to children, especially when we're mothers, to be able to bring that energy back in and draw it up and to get liberated from that power. We've got so much immense power. But if you make it about pelvic floor exercises, all of that is lost and our empowerment is lost. But even people like me, because I can recognize this discrimination and prejudice, we can experience Hinduphobia even though we're from the dominant class and even though we're from outside the culture from birth.
And Mali, just moving on, I believe you've got a lot of other projects in the pipeline and you've got a lot of unpublished papers too. So it'd be good, once you can do that, get into, your PhD. I know you're doing it part-time at the moment, but we urgently need work from our perspective, from the Indic perspective on Hinduphobia. So what you're doing is wonderful, it's excellent. So what we'll do is we'll put a link for your GoFund. So, our audience, our viewers, if they want to contribute to help you in that, they can do so. So we'd like to, make sure.
Thanks, Puna. Thanks, I really appreciate it. The next month, I've got 3 projects that need to be published pretty much immediately. One is an analysis of Hinduphobia denialism in the literature. So it's just a literature review of Hinduphobia denialism. That's our detractors. A literature review of the word usage, but with a little bit more detail of context to what I did before. And that will include the research on Hinduphobia, which is from 1851. So that's earlier. Indophobia and Hinduphobia together and looking at the differences between them. And then it will be a case study analysis of how Hinduphobia, with all of this information of our detractors and the examples from history, how that builds into Hinduphobia of today so that we can define it and apply it in legal terms. Because there's no point having a definition that can't be adjudicated. If a man goes to a court and says, I stabbed my wife because I loved her, and I didn't want her to be with anyone else, the court isn't going to say, well, that's not hatred. It's not misogyny. And therefore, we're going to let you off the hook because you loved her. Hinduphobia doesn't mean hatred or fear. Hinduphobia is a bias crime. When it gets to the legal stage, it's a bias crime. It's a human rights violation. It's religious vilification. And all of these definitions of Hindu misya, Hindu odium, Hindu dvesha, these really are self-destructive because it shows they don't understand what the word means to begin with. And the fact that root terms of words don't always end up meaning what we use them for today. So it's really beside the point. The word signifies an experience that people are having. And we need our words. So please don't throw them away, people. Please do not let people convince you that it doesn't mean hatred or fear and therefore you should just use another word, because what that does is it gives the detractors and the people who deny Hinduphobia, it gives them ammunition because they're saying it's a made-up word. They're saying it doesn't even exist. It's not a real word. Some Hindutva extremists made it up. And they only use it to deflect from the fact that they are themselves oppressors and perpetrators of violence. Like, this is the most barbarically Hinduphobic concept. But if you give them your word and say, oh, we won't use it anymore, we're going to make another one up, that's basically just falling straight into the trap.
Yeah. No, we've got the word and got to keep it and got to use it. I think that's what we've got to do.
The word. So we need to build more with academics. We need to pay them more, but we also need to work more and recognise that this team of academics in each country has to be built. So at least, you know, half a dozen scholars in each country working with institutions to help people to understand what it is, and teaching from school age like we do with other forms of racism in every sector of every society. So we need a lot of people, but they need to be professional. We can't have any more of these people who claim to be experts giving us the wrong information, because it's actually Hinduphobic itself, because it denies and it negates it negates the reception. It makes people not listen to us, and that actually builds Hinduphobia. So please, everybody, get the experts, you know, and make them work together, because if they don't work together, we can't grow, we can't build,
I agree,
we can't work forward.
Absolutely. And finally, Malini, what is your message to Hindus or those born in the Hindu tradition who dismiss even the existence of Hinduphobia due to their political alignment, lack of understanding, or simply because they consider themselves to be too modern to be concerned with it? What's your message to young Hindus?
I want to just explain a little bit about anti-Hindu sentiment as distinct from other forms of xenophobia with which it intersects and can overlap. For example, Hindus can experience racism at the same time as they experience prejudice against them because of their faith or because of their Indigenous beliefs or their Indigenous culture. These type of things can be compounded and complex. So I just want to explain so that people understand that Hinduphobia isn't something that's easy to define, and it doesn't just relate to things which are at the extreme far end. For example, when we see, you know, the Bangladeshi pogrom that happened recently and the selective targeted killings in Kashmir, for example, they are the very pointy end, the most violent aspects. We can be talking about things like just a vicarious prejudice, so people who are assumed to have something in common with Hindus who may believe, for example, in karma or reincarnation, which is quite common. People could question you and they could say, oh, that's just mumbo jumbo, or they're entitled to have their opinions. But if it's coming from a prejudice rather than a rational or analytical or factual basis, then it can be called Hinduphobia. Likewise, people can experience Hinduphobia because there is a misconception about their appearances and what type of peoples fit into a class. So we've had people who have experienced a fear of them being a terrorist in America after 9/11, and they were assumed, the actual violence was assumed to have been Islamophobia. But one of the problems with that is that Hindus take many kinds of appearances, and one of the aspects of Hinduphobia is that they could be confused for being a violent extremist. And that's well represented in these accounts of alleged saffron terrorism and, you know, Hindutva extremists, which are infiltrating the West. That's anti-immigrant sentiment. So you can see that already they're starting to deploy the same types of tropes and themes that are present in other forms of discrimination and prejudice. Anti-Indigenous sentiment we have here in Australia, where the British came and they used their superiority complex, their civilizational authority alleged to conduct massacres and genocides. They justified these acts, but really what they wanted was to colonize the territory and to take all of the land and strip everything away and to destroy the people, to remove them from, it's a logic of elimination. They had to you know, justify what they were doing by their own superiority complex. So we see this in Western empiricism, for example, when they don't accept views which are outside the domain of science, and you use natural medicine. If you use Ayurveda, for example, and somebody comes along and says that's just mumbo jumbo, even though it may have clinical trials attached to it, like Brahmi, that's got clinical trials, ashwagandha. There's many different herbs which have clinical trials, and somebody comes along and says, oh, why are you using that? You should go to the pharmacist. You know, that's all mumbo jumbo. That also could be anti-Hindu sentiment, because Ayurveda is part and parcel of the medical system of Hindus. So Hinduphobia is complex. You can be experiencing it even though you don't recognize you're experiencing it. When your yoga teacher strips out the Sanskrit, they won't do it for ballet, but they'll do it for yoga. They won't remove the French words for ballet because it's a high civilization, isn't it? They won't make their children practice ballet in English, but you will be forced to practice yoga in English in a gym. These are the little examples just to help people to reflect and to do some swadhyaya as to whether or not they do experience Hinduphobia, and try and think through when people have raised their eyebrows at you, for example, for having said something, or where you won't speak or you won't say something, you won't wear your traditional clothing, or you won't express yourself freely, you'll be silent in certain situations. And people may say, well, you just want to conform in those situations, and that may be true. But why is it that you need to conform? Because of bias or prejudice against your natural expression of your culture. So all of these elements make up anti-Hindu sentiment, and I'm pretty sure that most people who live in Australia would be able to recognise some of those elements, and who also live in other countries, they'll have different experiences. I just wanted to make that, I know it's a fairly complex summary, but it's very difficult to make it into a reductionist definition and then apply it without actually creating spaces where Hinduphobia can occur and be legitimated or be conducted with impunity. So that's why I've explained it that way, and I hope people reflect and start to get behind the cause and start to really speak up when they do experience Hinduphobia. Well, there is that sector of society that wants to pretend that we've reached utopia. They want to deny that social justice movements have any validity, or because they don't like the fact that, for example, socialists, communists, Marxists have pretty much dominated the social justice intelligentsia for decades. They don't want to be associated with that. And I can understand why, because they use very reductionist lenses, and sometimes they get things wrong because they won't keep continuously adapting to the experience of people on the ground. Like, things change. We're not the same Australia that we were 200 years ago. Things change, but we still have an issue of racism. It hasn't gone away. We still need to work on it, and it becomes more and more subtle and more sublimated. And as it becomes more sublimated and less visible in public, people tend to think, oh, it's all gone away. But we know that's not the case. There's still systemic violence and prejudice. There's still a slow type of genocide occurring in Australia against Indigenous peoples. And we've had genocides, massacres, we've had Indigenous cultural genocide, we've had epistemicide, we've had indigenocide in the Hindu traditions, and it's ongoing, it hasn't stopped. So please don't start thinking that we've reached utopia and suddenly everybody's going to get wealthy if they just devote themselves to work, because we know that doesn't even work. Capitalism even has its limits. You know, we need to make sure that people get what they need in society, and whether that means that we create social welfare systems, or we create advocacy groups, or we create legal groups so that people are getting their human rights. Even people who have money, for example, can have human rights violations conducted against them, like the Kashmir Pandits. They weren't all poor people. They had administrative roles. They were people that had some authority, and they had some power in the society, but they were ethnically cleansed. This concept of Jews, for example, who are wealthy, and that's part of anti-Semitism. So you can't say just because Hindus in America have got a whole pile of money because they're working for Silicon Valley, They don't experience Hinduphobia. That's a joke. That's just like anti-Semitism. They're wealthy. They're taking control. Look at them. They're all these extremists and they're infiltrating our system. They're going to take all of our power. They're going to bring in fascism. It's like the yellow peril, but it's the saffron peril. So, you know, look at it in a, people don't read. I think that's the problem. They don't read and they want to think they're above it all. So they don't want to get their hands dirty. They don't want to put their neck on the line, because people like me who speak about Hinduphobia, we get targeted by very, very dangerous people because they're invested in denying Hinduphobia, because maybe they were part or sympathise with the perpetrators of ethnic cleansings or massacres, or maybe they want to wash their hands clean of their colonial history.
And they want to stifle voices. But Marley, thank you so much for this really enlightening talk. We've learned a lot about Hinduphobia, and it's been a real learning experience for me. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to add, or before we go?
I just want to thank you for your time, and I know it's a very serious topic, and we've talked about everything from genocide through to, I guess, discrimination in modern societies, and it can be very traumatizing. So, you know, take it slowly, and everybody, you know, look after yourselves. But yeah, we need to work on this. It's a very, very serious problem.
Very, very important topic. Very
Yeah.
important topic. Thank you so much. Thank you. Namaskar. Namaste.
Thank you. Namaskar.